Now we would like to start the Plenary Session 3, Private Sector's Responsibility for Achieving Carbon Neutrality. First, I would like to introduce the moderators for this session, Mr. John Moore and Professor Lawrence Tubiana. Mr. Moore is an ICEF Steering Committee member and Chief Executive Officer at Bloomberg NEF. Professor Tubiana is also an ICEF Steering Committee member, CEO of the European Climate Foundation, Chair of the Board of Governors for the French Development Agency, and Professor at Sciences Po Paris. The speakers for this session are Ms. Sarah Chandler, Senior Director of Environment and Supply Chain Innovation and Operations, Apple. Mr. Julian Perez, Vice President of Strategy and Policy, Oil and Gas Climate Initiative. Mr. Xavier Denoli, Sustainable Development Senior Vice President of Schneider Electric. Mr. Takahashi Kenji, General Manager of Decarbonization Promotion Section, Corporate Strategy Department, JERA. Ms. Antonina Shia, researcher at the Transition Pathway Initiative, London School of Economics and Political Science, Grantham Research Institute on Climate Change and the Environment. And we'd like to inform you that Ms. Chandler has contributed a video message for the session, but will not be participating in the discussion. And now I would like to ask Mr. Moore to moderate this session. Mr. Moore, if you please.
Thank you very much for joining us. Good afternoon, everybody. You've already had sessions at ICEF around policy innovation, around behavioral innovation, and also a number of technology sessions around the food system, the energy system, around nuclear power and negative emissions, and also digital technology. So it's a lot to take in. But now what we're going to do is really focus on the private sector and how the private sector what's their responsibility towards net zero. I mean, the first question is there real commitment there? And what we have seen is since the beginning of last year, government commitment, so the emissions covered around the world, government commitments have risen from 34%, where there is some form of net zero target, some discussion of that at least, all the way up to 70% now. So you've seen a massive increase in government commitment. On the finance side, what we've seen is a trebling of sustainable debt issuance. In 2018, that was $250 billion, so 250 billion. That trebled to 750 billion last year, and that number has already been exceeded in H1. And similarly, on the company side, if you look at Science-Based Target Initiative as a good example, in 2018, 200 companies committed to setting out plans towards net zero, and that number last year was 600. So again, a trebling in 3 years, and again in H1 of 2021, that has been exceeded. So I think the commitment really is there. So in this session, what we're going to do is really talk about three questions. One, how are targets set and how are strategies being aligned by companies? Two, how can companies accelerate deployment of technology? So a lot of the technology exists today. How is that going to be accelerated? And three, how should companies approach the hard-to-abate sectors? So these where the technology is not yet cost-effective or widely available. And before that, what we're going to do is have 5 different videos from some of our panelists. And with that, we're going to start with Sarah Chandler from Apple. So please play the video.
Hello, I'm Sarah Chandler, and I lead environment and supply chain innovation at Apple. As you all know, the science is clear. Our world cannot wait for a carbon neutral economy. We are over 1 year into Apple's most ambitious environmental commitment to date, to become carbon neutral for our entire supply chain and the lifetime use of our devices by 2030. Our environmental work has always stemmed from big ideas and tough questions. Questions like, Can we power all of Apple's operations with renewable energy? Can we make our products and packaging with only recycled and renewable materials? And can we continue to lead our industry in helping to keep our products safe for those who make, use, and recycle them? Questions like these shape our environmental approach and speak to our three key priorities: addressing climate change, conserving the Earth's precious resources, and pioneering the use of smarter chemistry. Today, I'll focus on our work to fight climate change. At Apple, this means using more renewable energy to power our operations, driving energy efficiency in our devices and processes, and pioneering low carbon and recycled materials in our products. We start with a careful measurement of our comprehensive carbon footprint. First, we address our own corporate footprint, which includes emissions from electricity used at facilities as well as business travel and employee commute. In 2020, we announced that we're carbon neutral for our corporate emissions, and we continue to source 100% renewable electricity at all of our offices, retail stores, and data centers across 44 countries. But we know that our responsibility extends beyond our direct operations to the entire life cycle of our products. As you can see, this is where the remainder of Apple's footprint is today, and where we are focusing in order to be carbon neutral by 2030. Our approach to meeting this goal is informed by science. First, we plan to reduce our emissions by 75%. We can reduce emissions at every stage of a product's life, innovating low carbon materials, designing for maximum durability, helping customers trade in devices so that they can be used again and again, and pioneering robotics and machine learning tools to recycle and recover materials at end of life. We are also working closely with our manufacturing partners to increase energy efficiency and transition to 100% renewable energy. In Japan, these partners include major companies like Sony and Murata. While we plan to reduce our overall emissions by 75%, there is still the remaining 25% of our emissions that can't be avoided. To address this, we'll remove the equivalent amount of carbon from the atmosphere, starting by using nature-based solutions, like this carbon-storing mangrove forest we invested in. Even as our business grew, these efforts and others avoided over 15 million metric tons of emissions in 2020. That's like taking more than 3 million cars off the road per year. Another powerful tool is our voice. We use it to advocate for policies that have impact far beyond our supply chain, like in March of this year, when we joined with the Japan Climate Leaders Partnership and RE100 members to ask the Japanese government to accelerate its renewable energy ambitions. This work is backed by real investment. This year, we announced progress toward our $4.7 billion green bond spend that brings clean energy to local communities while helping Apple reduce carbon emissions. These are systemic and long-standing issues, and we don't pretend to have all the answers. What we do have are goals to strive for and a global community of businesses committed to doing the right thing by people and the planet. Thank you for your leadership and continued partnership in pushing forward the urgent work of climate solutions.
Thank you very much, Sarah. Very holistic view there, and covering lots of technologies, lots of target, and also the broader from consumers back to supply chains. Thank you very much. With that, what I'd like to do is hand over to Julian Perez from OGCI.
Hello, everyone. Thanks a lot for welcoming me at the ICEF. It's a great pleasure to join again. I'm Julian Perez. I'm the VP Strategy and Policy for OGCI, the Oil and Gas Climate Initiative. And I'm going to share with you some thoughts around the way we would like to engage into a low carbon transition pathway. So let me start first with the facts. Roughly speaking, the global man-made emission are 50 gigatons of CO2 emission. And 35 of it is coming from energy and 20 gigatons from the oil and gas. If you take now at the energy demand, the oil and gas today means more than half of this demand. Oil and gas is meeting some captive markets like long-haul transport, chemicals, high heat for industrial processes, planes, ships, etc. And oil and gas is also a fragmented landscape. Some large companies and numerous very small. Some are state-owned, the largest, and some are international players. This is why I personally believe that embarking the energy players, and notably the oil and gas sector, in a collaboration platform is critical. The size of the prize is huge, and their position in the global economy, alongside their capacity and competencies, make the industry an absolutely essential player to involve and embark to accelerate the transition. In an extremely critical time for the oil and gas industry and society at large, the OGCI can represent a very influential player. So let me introduce you to what is OGCI. OGCI is a CEO-led initiative. It's led by the CEO of the member companies. It regroups 12 large oil and gas companies, international and state-owned or national oil companies that make up roughly 30% of the oil and gas production. It was launched at the UN Climate Summit in September 2014 to accelerate their industry response to climate change and in support of the Paris Agreement. Today, OGCI aims to be a catalyst to accelerate the reduction of emissions from the oil and gas sector and its contribution and transformation to a low carbon economy. We aim to be additional. We don't want to repeat what the market is offering, nor than what our member companies are already doing. So we aim to be additional, both with respect to the various segments of the low carbon transition. We do that by working together on collective ambitions, targets, and collective action. And there is a real urgency to act. Probably no industry needs to change more drastically and more rapidly than the oil and gas sector to mitigate the climate crisis. Early September, the 12 CEOs of our member companies agreed on a new OGCI strategy, establishing a renewed strategic framework for us to drive actions toward a net zero future and to speed up decarbonization. So this new strategy is based on 3 pillars. The first one is to get to net zero operation and leverage our influence, focusing on both direct and indirect emissions. All 12 OGCI member companies have committed to reach net zero emission from operation under their control, what is called Scope 1 and 2, within the time frame set by the Paris Agreement. And all will leverage their influence to achieve the same in a non-operated asset. This is new for all the companies. This commitment amounts to circa 1 gigaton CO2 equivalent per year. This is roughly speaking the equivalence of emission made by all planes around the world. Leveraging our leadership position in the industry, OGCI will also accelerate in embarking the rest of the industry. As the world continues to need oil and gas, we need to reduce emission associated with its production. Addressing the Scope 1 and 2 of the oil and gas industry is a must. It represents 4 gigaton for all oil and gas, nearly the equivalent to the entire US emission. We have never shared such an ambition before, and it's a stretch for all the companies. None of them before ever announced concrete action to engage on the assets where they only have an equity interest, but no operational control. And for some of them, it's the first time that they have a net zero target. It demonstrates the power of collaboration. Have in mind that OGCI includes companies from China, the Middle East, Europe, Latin America, and the US. The long-term ambition is also underpinned by new and updated short-term targets, practical for carbon and methane. We overachieved our previous targets, removing 15 million tons of CO2 since 2017, and our new target will allow us to double this figure by 2025. This is concrete, this is short-term. By doing so, we send a signal to the market. We pave the way, and we help the world to transition in an ordered manner. Now addressing the lion's share, the 16 gigaton associated with the consumption of our product. This is the third pillar, and we aim to accelerate actions to help decarbonize society. We'll do that by increasing our capacity to expand the use of renewable hydrogen, energy efficiency. All of them are core of the oil and gas company's strategy today. OGCI companies invest more than $7 billion per year for many years in this solution. And some of our members are already championing in a number of segments of the low carbon energy transition, such as solar, wind, batteries, etc. In addition, we are equipped with a joint fund, OGCI Climate Investment, who is cutting and deploying new technologies. We also partners with universities, NGOs, value chains, and multilateral donors to support science and next generation of solutions. Let's be clear, Oil and gas players are long-term energy players. None of them are passively looking at the energy transition happening. This is a basic economic rationale. Another solution is to neutralize the emission of entire industrial hubs, and notably hard-to-abate sources like cement or steel. And we do that using carbon capture and storage. To date, within the OGCI, we have 8 hubs in our Kickstarter program, and where we dedicate resources to bring them to life. We're also scouting the next wave of hubs, and we have identified already nearly 1 gigaton of CO2 emissions, which could be neutralized at a cost below $100 per ton, without changing the infrastructure, without impacting in existing jobs, and enabling to scale up low-carbon hydrogen production, for instance. Here again, this industry is uniquely positioned to accelerate the development of the solution, with in-depth understanding of geological formation in which the CO2 is injected, or by mastering hydrogen production and delivery. So in conclusion, going forward, we must continue on this pathway of collaboration to turn strategy into action. The statu quo is not an option. There is a profound shift underway. We must be relentless in turning strategy into action. Collaboration is key. Oil and gas players bring, again, a unique combination of skill set, and they should be embarked into this transition rather than putting aside. They bring technical competencies, financial capacities, international footprint, capacity to run very large and complex projects involving multiple stakeholders. And it is the time that oil and gas companies are recognized as part of the solution rather than the problem itself. OGCI are committing to leading the industry through the transition, and I'm looking for this event to accelerate this collaboration pathway. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Julien. And it's amazing to hear about the volumes in terms of sort of 20 gigatons of the 50, and but great to hear about the collective action and the collective target setting and the ambition there. So that is fantastic. Thank you very much. And with that, we're going to play a video from Xavier Denoli from Schneider Electric.
Hello, my name is Xavier Denoli, and I'm the Senior Vice President for Sustainable Development at Schneider Electric. Very good to be with you today. Who is Schneider Electric? Schneider Electric is a global company operating in more than 100 countries with a sales revenue of approximately $30 billion. We are a tech company involved in sustainability and efficiency, delivering products, systems, software, and services in 2 main areas of operation, which is energy management and industrial automation. We deliver smart and green solutions for the 4 end markets, which are the building market, the data center market, industry, and infrastructure. Our capacity to deliver very significant CO2 emission reduction, increase in operational efficiency, reduction of materials and resources used, as well as providing electricity to people who do not have access to reliable energy, makes Schneider Electric a leading company in its field. The purpose of Schneider Electric is to empower all, to make the most of our energy and resources, bridging progress and sustainability. At Schneider, we call this Life is On. The mission of the company is to be our customers' digital partner for sustainability and efficiency. We are, of course, working hard in addressing the energy paradox which is in front of us. And basically, on the one hand, on the left-hand side, we know that energy is an absolute need for everybody and for progress, but it's also the primary source of greenhouse gas emissions. At the same time, there are still 2 billion people around the world who still do not have access to reliable electricity, and it is a basic human right. Every country has made a pledge in the past few years. Many companies are working on it, but let's face it, we are not on track to be able to limit the global warming. How do we judge whether we are on track? Is we use science-based targets, and science tells us that we have to remain below 1.5 degree elevation if we want to avoid the maximum consequences of this situation. Right now, with all the pledges and the targets made, we are more in the region of 2.5 to 3.5 degrees elevation, which of course is not acceptable. We need collectively to save three times more CO2 emissions by 2030, which is basically accelerating very drastically what we are doing against this situation. We can still meet the challenge, but every day that passes by is making it a lot harder. What we need to do is, first of all, to decarbonize the energy supply, to remove all the coal, for example, power plants, which are generating electricity at the cost of CO2 emission. We need to electrify everything that needs to be electrified, to move to electrical powering. And finally, of course, we need to contain the consumption, and that's energy efficiency, to be able to reduce the threshold of consumption by all companies. Every company now has a duty to reduce its own emission across the entire value chain, from its own operations, scope 1 and 2, to the much wider scope 3 operations, all the way to scope 4, which is basically all the solutions to be able to avoid or save CO2 emissions. Schneider Electric is uniquely positioned to tackle this challenge. We have been leading by example in our own ecosystem for years, for more than 15 years when we started this sustainability challenge. So we are seen as a leading practitioner on the field. We were recognized in 2021 as the world's most sustainable company by Corporate Knights. At the same time, for the E part of ESG, the environment part, we can be, and we have the tools and solutions to be our customers' #1 digital partner for sustainability and efficiency. And we have a special division, which is called the Sustainability Business Division, which is here to take our customers by the hand in order to take them through their decarbonization journey. As a practitioner for our own operations, Schneider has made long-term commitments for climate positivity, for being efficient with resources, governance with the principles of trust, create also equal opportunities, and use the best of the generations that we have. This has led us to define 2 plans, which are our key impacts. We call that the Schneider Sustainability Impact, which are transformational plans on which we make public commitments by 2025 in all these 6 long-term commitment dimensions. We measure the progress of our company every quarter against all of these dimensions in order to show progress. This is the carbon pledge by Schneider Electric, whereby we are aiming by 2025 of being carbon neutral on our own operations, and also to be carbon neutral on our entire end-to-end value chain by 2040. Our sustainability business division is the best enabler that exists on the market today to help our customers decarbonize. What we do is we help customers reduce their consumption, energy efficiency, replace their energy sources with renewable, balance the rest that cannot be abated with carbon credits and offset, and really work with the suppliers upstream on decarbonization, using circularity, for example, and using our own offers and solutions. Sustainability Business Division is a global arm providing consulting to help customers in an agnostic way to identify the situation for their own company. And then also Schneider has the capacity to provide real-life solutions for it. What we say at Schneider is sustainability is a marathon without a finishing line. Thank you.
Thank you, Xavier. Thank you, Javier, for that. You certainly win the video stakes on this panel, and it was great to hear not just about supply, but also about the sort of need for electrification and the need for energy efficiency, and also interesting to hear about a sort of new division, the sustainability business division, again, sort of organizationally aligning to the new net zero goal. So thank you very much for that. And next we'll turn to Mr. Kenji Takahashi from Jura.
Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everybody. My name is Kenji Takahashi, General Manager of Promotion Decarbonization Section of JERA. I'd like to thank the organizers and members of ICEF for giving us a chance to join today's session on the responsibility of achieving global decarbonization by 2050. Let me start from briefly touching upon an introduction of JERA's Zero CO2 emission challenge focused on decarbonization of thermal power generation. JERA was founded in 2015 and in 2019 merged the fuel and thermal power generation sector of TEPCO and Tube Electric Power. JERA now boasts deep expertise in this field through its vertically integrated functions from upstream to power generation and wholesale power and gas. JERA supplies about 30% of total electricity demand in Japan, supplying to areas including Tokyo and Nagoya. That means JERA has a responsibility of keeping supply of electricity at a reasonable price. As the largest power producer, JERA is in a position of actively leading the way to realize decarbonization. So, in October last year, JERA announced that JERA Zero CO2 Emission 2050, in which JERA would take on the challenge of achieving zero CO2 emissions from our operations in Japan and overseas by 2050. As part of this strategy, JERA is working on the development of renewable energy focused on offshore wind, and JERA is also proposing the use of zero-emission thermal power generation by switching fuel to hydrogen ammonia. Zero-emission thermal power will take a role of the adjustment function for power systems and keeping a balance of power supply and demand. This slide shows how JERA tackles decarbonization by 2050, together with keeping a stable supply. There are three challenges. Today, let me focus on the second pillar, ammonia. The point is to minimize transition risk and cost with considering limited potential renewable energy in Japan. We think ammonia is a realistic and feasible decarbonization solution as of today. We will proceed with ammonia to switch from coal step by step. The first step is 20% ammonia demonstration test at commercial scale in early 2020s. Then, based on the result of demonstration, we will proceed to start full-scale operation with economical support. We expect the final step in 2040s is that thermal power plant to use 100% ammonia through replacement to new plants. Compared to ammonia, hydrogen is still in the early stage, such as transportation technology is not developed at commercial level. JERA start feasible study and will plan demonstration test of co-firing hydrogen in natural gas power plant in mid-2020s. Hopefully, we can start full-scale operation in 2030s, but it's still challenging. This slide shows the outline of demonstration test of 20% ammonia generation in existing power plant. The demonstration will be performed at Hekinan Thermal Power Station in Aichi Prefecture, Japan. The installation and modification work will take a few years, and we can start demonstration test until fiscal 2024. This modification for ammonia requires additional investment, but relatively small, because most of existing facility can be used. As a next step, we will plan to proceed with the study for further increasing the rate of ammonia in early 2030s. With regard to clean fuel, there are still challenges such as clean fuel supply chain. It is true that ammonia industry has already established supply chain of ammonia, but once we start using fuel ammonia for power sector, the such demand is so large compared to the current size of ammonia market. For example, 20% ammonia firing in 1 gigawatt power plant uses about 0.5 million tons of ammonia in 1 year, which is relatively big compared to the current market in Japan, which is 1 million tons per year. So, we need to develop a resilient supply chain to accommodate clean fuels demand. JERA takes an advantage of natural gas supply chain expertise to participate in the entire clean fuel supply chain. It's also important to promote application of the technology, especially in Asia, to facilitate decarbonization in those countries where the coal power plants are relatively new and continue to supply power along with their economic growth. At last, they are promoting development focus on offshore wind. Our target is 5 gigawatt development in 2050. We are gaining much experience through project developments and operations globally with advanced renewable energy business, and then applying that expertise to offshore wind project in Japan. In summary, as the largest power company in Japan and as a global energy company, JERA will take on the challenge of decarbonization by 2050, especially to decarbonize fuels of thermal power generation, starting from feasible level of co-firing ratio and to reach 100% zero emission thermal power step by step. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Kenji-san. It's very good to hear from Japan's largest power producer, and really interesting to hear about the different technologies and transitions that you will have to manage. You were the first to mention sort of transition risk, and I think that's an important thing for us to think about over the coming years and decades. So thank you very much for that. And finally, we'll turn to Antonina Schier from TPI.
Hi, thanks very much for having me. My name is Antonina Schier, and I'm a researcher at the Transition Pathway Initiative. I'll be giving a quick presentation on how we at TPI assess corporate climate governance and alignment. Before delving into how TPI assesses companies, I'll just give a brief background on the sphere in which the TPI tool operates, which is the financial sector. So from a financial perspective, climate risks fall into two broad categories. First, there are the physical risks of actual climate change fueled disasters, and then there are the more socially determined so-called transition risks, which are driven by, for example, stronger regulations that could harm the profits of big polluters, and also legal cases, which have been brought against companies and countries for failing to meet or to set ambitious climate targets. Understandably, investors want to mitigate their financial risk, and so they've begun to pay attention to climate performance of companies. However, they also can and should play a role in actually driving climate action. They can do this through capital allocation that favors companies and sectors that are aligned with climate goals, and they can also do it through shareholder engagement with companies to demand more ambitious decarbonization plans. TPI was founded in 2017 as a global investor-led initiative. The aim is to provide data for investors so that they can both mitigate their transition risk, but also engage with companies on the indicators and the alignment scores that we provide. TPI provides open access assessments online of 401 companies across 16 high-emitting sectors such as electricity, steel, and aviation. Broadly, what we do is that we assess companies' progress on the low-carbon transition using public corporate disclosure. Currently, TPI has 110 supporters with $30 trillion in assets, combined assets under management and advice. TPI assesses companies using two complementary components. First, we have management quality, which evaluates companies' governance of emissions and their governance of the risks and opportunities arising from the low-carbon transition. Second, we have carbon performance, which involves a quantitative benchmarking of companies' emissions intensity pathways against Paris-aligned benchmarks. And I'll now give a bit more detail into each of these and how they work. So to start, here is our management quality staircase. We've developed this staircase and the data underlying it with our data partner, FTSE Russell. So the framework includes 19 indicators, and they each test whether or not a company has implemented a particular carbon management practice. The indicators are then distributed along a staircase that puts companies into 5 levels. The levels range from level 0, where companies are not even aware of climate change, or they at least have not demonstrated an awareness of climate change, to level 4, where they've demonstrated that climate governance has been strategically integrated into how they operate. So for example, some of the indicators we have include setting an emissions reduction target at level 2, and then some of the more sophisticated indicators include the first indicator on level 3, which is nominating a board member or committee with explicit responsibility for the oversight of climate change policy. On level 4, there's an important indicator which asks whether the company has incorporated climate change performance into the executive remuneration system. So this is just a brief overview of how we assess the climate governance of companies at TPI. Now, jumping to carbon performance, the idea here is that we compare historical and targeted company emissions intensities with sector-specific benchmarks. We develop these benchmarks using the sectoral decarbonization approach and using data from the International Energy Agency. We have 3 benchmarks for each sector, and we're currently in the process of updating them, so we'll be soon publishing a national pledges scenario, a below 2 degrees scenario, which is a continuation of the current one we have, and a brand new, highly ambitious 1.5 degrees scenario. The way that the sectoral decarbonization approach works is that we take from the IEA a scenario-specific emissions budget for each sector. So for example, I think it works best just providing an example. So for the steel sector, in 2050, the IEA provides a budget of a certain amount of gigatons of CO2 under, for example, a 1.5 degree scenario. And they also provide a projection of how much crude steel will be produced in that year. So using these 2 figures for all the years between now and 2050, we can create this smooth interpolated pathway of the 1.5 degree scenario, for example. And so a company whose current emissions intensity or its targeted emissions intensity is below that particular intensity required of the 1.5 degrees scenario in 2050, that company would be considered aligned. And so basically the labor that we do at TPI is calculating these benchmarks and understanding sectoral boundaries required to make this an adequate way of assessing a given company. And then we also produce the company pathways where we collect data on the emissions intensity of companies and also calculate where their targets will lead them in their carbon emissions intensity pathways. So I've been asked to join this panel not just as a member of the TPI team, but also to provide a bit of a youth perspective on this panel. The main thing I'd just like to share quickly here is one of the takeaways I've had from my participation in Generation Climate, which is a group of young people that have been asked to contribute to session design at the New York Times COP26 Climate Hub. The main message I'd like to convey from the group that I've been privileged to work with, the group of young people that are part of Generation Climate, is that we really need to emphasize climate justice. And this isn't just a just transition for fossil fuel workers around the world, but also particularly international justice, whereby developed nations who have benefited from historical emissions and who have the financial capacity to invest in very steep decarbonization pathways should do so, and they should also support emissions reductions and a just transition in the global south. This is a really strong message that I just wanted to share. And I'd also like to mention that younger generations are going to be pushing more of companies, but not just as consumers, but as activists, as voters, as litigants, as investors, and as employees. So thanks very much, and I look forward to speaking with the other panelists. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Antonina. And it really interesting to bring the financial sector into this, because obviously how the financial sector view the energy transition is key. So understanding those metrics and how the finance sector operates, and also, of course, getting a different perspective, because one of the themes of ICEF this year is to get a different, more youthful perspective on it. So again, that's really, thank you very much for bringing that. So now I think we have about 30 minutes. And the plan was to cover sort of three different areas, one around target setting and strategy alignment, one around accelerating rollout of existing technologies, and one around the hard-to-abate sectors. And you've heard from most of the panelists. I'm going to say special thanks to Professor Tubiana Laurence. Very good for you to join us. Thank you very much for that. And I may actually start just by asking you, we've been talking about company targets, maybe ask you about the EU, because the EU has spent a lot of time thinking about its targets to be set, and how that's, how that's progressed, and also how the private sector plays into that.
Thank you, John, and very interested in the presentation that have been privileged to hear. So as you know, EU has set a quite ambitious target of minus 55% by 2030. And this, of course, within the actual policy instrument we have, which is, of course, the emission trading system, that and you may have noticed that now the prices are ramping up rapidly on this market, plus a number of regulation on norms and standards on a number of sectors. So there is, one side of the policy is clearly to align the policy instrument, the regulation, vis-a-vis the economic sectors, and on the other side, of course, to try to develop a particular methodology on the extra financial reporting to introduce some element of data collection, public data collection in particular. And so as a company, there is an element of evaluation, which I think resonates very well, which I have heard from Antonina. So on the first side, on the elements of regulation on the policy instrument, what is interesting is we see now that the norms and standards are now really, in particular on the automotive sector, we have seen already the more severity on the decision on the standards is bringing very rapidly the change to electrification of transport. But now, of course, there is as well investment policy, in particular on green hydrogen, which we have been discussing already. And it's interesting to see that there is a huge collective effort of EU governments to invest public funding together with private funding. Second, there is, of course, all the element of the European Investment Bank, who is now really phasing out any investment on portfolio of fossil fuel and really concentrating the investment into this new industrial infrastructure of green. On the element which I think is really connect with our last discussion on the targets is now that there is the elaboration of the taxonomy, which was, of course, an element of information for the financial sector to try to understand where was the green and the brown activities, just to give indication to the financial investment. But second, the element is to try to have a more precise evaluation from the company's reporting system, what we call the extra financial reporting system, to be able to follow how much, in a way, how serious are the commitments of companies to net zero by 2050, which is anyway the net zero emissions target by 2050 being, of course, the norm for all economic actors wherever they are in EU. And that connect well with, of course, all the discussion of the transparency, the targets, the pathways, which I think is very central in our conversation of today. The private sector is both, of course, the innovation, the deployment of the strategy, but at the same time, giving transparency and credibility to that is a way to explain how it will be, how these strategies, these pathways of decarbonization will be implemented. And in a way, as a consequence, ask for a regulation that is stable. So companies can really, and investors can really align their strategy vis-a-vis a very stable regulation framework. So that's where Europe is trying to, in a way, go a little bit ahead on the taxonomy, on the norms and standards, on this extra reporting type of monitoring. I think we are a little bit ahead of the curve compared to other countries. And hopefully there will be good discussion with other partners at global level to try to harmonize, to facilitate the global supply chain organization. Thank you. I think we should not be too long. Huh?
Thank you very much. And maybe I will ask Kenji-san, just from a sort of Japan perspective, how you know, are you looking towards Europe to see what's happening there? How do you think about globally how things are changing, and also what that might mean for Japan?
Yeah, thank you for asking. Yeah, and also thank you for the good presentation and overall. Yeah, I think that in Japan, just that Japanese government discussing the energy policy, a new energy policy right now, and of course the Japanese government the step to the expanding the renewable energy, and also just start some innovation with such hydrogen and ammonia is a type of zero emission fuel for the power generation in a new government, a new energy policy. So I think of course the EU and the US is such a very good effort, and also the Japanese government target in the 2030 is 46% reduction from the 2013. So it's very challenging. But each sector, private sector, try to in that achieving such a target in collaborating with the government to some company has the innovation, and some company is just such a financial support or financial scheme to the introduction such a decarbonization technology. So just in the Japanese government focus the transition for the important, not only the green bond or such a green financing, and also such a transition financing is very important to the transition, to the achieving such target. That from me.
Thank you very much. So yeah, it seems like you have eyes on other parts of the world, but clearly what is happening in Japan is going to be very specific, and it does feel like every country now is starting to work out from a sort of industrial sort of approach, and import export and those fuel mixes, etc., starting to generate their own plans, which I think is great. Thank you very much. And Julian, similar, you're looking across one of the most major sectors, oil and gas sectors. Again, from a sort of target perspective, your members operate all around the world. So I suppose, how do you sort of balance sort of internal target setting versus what's happening on the outside? Sort of how do you manage that sort of interaction, let's say?
Thanks, John. And actually, I may add another layer of complexities, that we have national companies and international companies. So some of them have, investors. Some of them are state-owned. And actually, you probably know that in the oil and gas sector, more than 75% of the volume that is traded and produced is led by the state-owned company. So it's very important for us to embark those companies behind us, but that means that we embark as well the governments, of course, when we set this type of targets, as you can imagine. And among our members, we have, when I think about the NOCs, we have, Saudi Aramco, so the Saudi Arabia government, the Brazilian with Petrobras, and the Chinese with CNPC. So also all very big player in the climate negotiation, and this is why also we think that the role that we set targets with our member companies is that we also embark the governments behind us, and so to some extent we contribute hopefully to facilitate a little bit the international negotiation. With respect to your more specific question, I think there's two things that we try to address. The target setting, it's absolutely critical, and I join as well what Laurence was saying earlier about the transparency. I think it's absolutely critical that those targets are set with methodology that are robust, that can be challenged by anyone, where you have also a third party coming in and checking that the figures that you are providing are robust and based on the best available technologies, for instance, to measure. But so when it comes to the target setting, I think we have two approach when we try to push our member and the rest of the industry to set targets. One is to set a long-term goal. That's very important, mid-century perspective, or because that gives you the North Star and make sure that we're going to meet the goal. When you think about the size of the oil and gas industry, again, as I was saying in my presentation, it's 40% of the man-made emission. And so we do believe that we need to have this industry setting those type of targets, because sorting the climate challenge without addressing the energy mix would be full, and addressing the energy mix without engaging the players that cover more than half of it for decades would be full as well, I think. So this is why we do believe that it's very important to work with them and not against or ignore them. But those long-term goals should also be underpinned by short-term targets. So within OGCI, we have set like this net zero goal that we have released earlier this year, on focusing on scope 1 and 2 operational domain, plus the non-operated. So basically addressing emission where our member companies have equity share but not the operational control, and also engage to embark the rest of the industry. This is again the 4 gigatons challenge I was mentioning earlier. And then addressing the scope 3 come with distribution of new way of energy. So most of our companies are looking and investing already in embarking a number of new low carbon solutions. Some of them are leading the solar market or the wind market, or energy efficiency, hydrogen, sustainable mobility, etc. And so these are the long-term goals, if I may. And then you have the short-term one, which are extremely important as well, because you have to be accountable at some stage, and you have to make sure that you are going through milestone that puts you on the right trajectory. We cannot wait to 2049. All the world will wake up and we'll realize that we are missing the goal. So short-term targets are very, very critical.
Okay, thank you very much. Also for highlighting the sort of private and state. So again, the sort of state-owned companies are a massive piece of this, which again is why sort of government targets are so important. But also highlighting, thank you, that the sort of short versus the long term. We long-term ambition, but also short-term targets. Maybe Antonina, I could ask you from a finance perspective. So we talked a lot about transparency and short and long-term targets. So what does good look like from a finance perspective? What are finance looking for from companies?
No, it's a great question. I think the other speakers covered a lot of the things that I would say targets require. So targets should be as detailed as possible on the scope that's covered, on the target year and the base year, and what geographical coverage the target has. So does it apply to all operations of the company or only in some regions? And I noted in the JERA target, you do say it covers all regions, and that's always really helpful for assessing targets to know where it applies. I absolutely echo the importance of interim targets to both validate and kind of provide some assurance that the long-term target will be underpinned by interim efforts, but also to create a more accurate pathway over time. Because at TPI, what we do is we interpolate between the latest historical emissions intensity that we calculate and the targeted intensity So interim targets help us provide a more accurate picture of what the company is aiming to do. Good targets also include scope 3, especially in sectors where the majority of life cycle emissions of the activity in question occur elsewhere in the supply chain. So oil and gas is a perfect example of this, where if oil and gas companies are not thinking about the emissions that take place when their customers burn the products they sell, then that's not quite an adequate target from a mitigation perspective. Similarly, auto manufacturers, the main thing that they should be thinking about is the scope 3 use of their products. They should absolutely also be decarbonizing their manufacturing activities, but scope 3 is clearly very important. Transparency on offsets is important in targets as well. I would say that it was quite helpful to see in the Apple target that they aim to meet 25% of their emissions to net zero using offsets, and transparency on what kinds of offsets will be used is important, given that there is controversy around the use of offsets for good reason. So transparency on that is really important for investors to understand what kinds of risks companies may be inviting, because offsets have not just the risk that companies may use the offsets instead of mitigating internally. That's the main risk that is often talked about with offsets, but also it's possible that as demand for offsets increase, as the regulation of offset markets improve, the price of each offset credit could increase a lot. And so we could see companies expecting to be able to buy cheap offsets at today's prices, and they'll face a much more expensive decarbonization plan if those offsets cost more in the future than they expect. And my last point about good targets, I would say within TPI, we have the challenge of thinking about regional alignment with climate goals and global alignment. And by this, I mean, a lot of the companies we assess, because we assess the largest companies by market capitalization, a lot of the companies we assess operate around the world. And so a global emissions intensity target and a global emissions intensity benchmark makes the most sense because they could be operating in various regions. However, for certain sectors, especially electricity, operations tend to be somewhat more localized and regionalized. So in those cases, TPI is actually currently developing regional benchmarks where we will be assessing companies based in OECD countries on a stricter regional benchmark than companies operating in non-OECD countries. And what this means for 1.5 degrees, for example, is that electricity utilities based in OECD countries should be aiming for net zero by 2035 for a 1.5 degrees future. This is the benchmark we have based on the IEA's 1.5 degrees net zero by 2050 report. So the date of hitting net zero is also important in targets, and it could depend on where the companies operate, which brings in the question of climate justice that I had highlighted in the presentation.
Great, thank you very much for that. So sort of interim target, scope 3, offsets clarity, and then the regional versus global balance. That's a great list. And you mentioned electrification and the acceleration of that. So let me bring Xavier in. And Xavier, you also mentioned that on a quarterly basis, so there's target setting, but then there's the actual execution. You mentioned on a quarterly basis, you're monitoring your goals. So could you say a little bit about how your company how do you align the goal setting piece, the long and the short, then with the actual operation? How does that really work in practice?
Thank you very much, John. So much like everybody else, we are in the same, facing the same challenges. Schneider has been embarked into a carbon footprint measurement for about 10 years. And of course, it was a trial and error at first. Not so many people were doing it at the time. But first of all, for us, we do not see anything but a global view, first of all, because we are responsible for our company and the consequences of our company on our environment. So that's number one, so global approach. Number two is scope 1, 2, and 3. In the experience of Schneider Electric, and this might shock a number of people, but scope 1 and 2 is only 1% of Schneider Electric emissions. 90% is with our customers, and the remainder, around 10%, is with our suppliers. For us, what is at stake Of course, we will do our own, let's say, house cleaning, but that's only a small part of the equation. For us, the bigger challenge is to be able to work with our business partners, being upstream our suppliers, or downstream with our customers, in order to be able to decarbonize. And believe me, this is really, really very heavy lifting for us, but we manage because of the, let's say, the mentalities have changed, and many people understand now deeply the necessity to do something about it. What we have also observed is many companies have no clue on how to get started. So basically what we do at Schneider, we have an approach to decarbonization that we have, let's say, developed in our own company first, and now that we propose to our business partners. And the first thing that we want to do is to strategize. Is basically measure first, measure the carbon footprint to see where we are, where one company is, again, on all the scopes. Define a strategy, an ambition. So I concur with what has been said that we need a long-term ambition. We need a middle point. So the middle point commonly accepted is around 2030. But what's really, really important is that all this has to be backed by science. And at Schneider Electric, we use SBTi as the reference to be on the trajectory of 1.5 degrees. So once the strategy, the measurement is done, we need to digitize. And that's one of the great, let's say, leverages that we can use in order to measure, to be able to track, to report, to know where we stand at any time. Digitization is here to help us. Digitization means in every single site, every single operation, we have the proper sensing points where we can measure almost in real time what is the situation, what are the gaps, what are the progress or the deviations. And lastly, we want to decarbonize, replace, basically electrify everything that can be electrified first, replace all the sources of electrical energy with renewable, reduce the energy consumed with energy efficiency, and that's the core business of Schneider for 50 years. So this is where we come from. And engage with the entire value chain, as I've mentioned, with the suppliers and the customers. So long-term objectives, midpoints, and to your question, John, what we do is we function with what we call sustainability barometers. So basically, it depends. It's on a period of 3 to 5 years. Currently, this is a 5-year period from the beginning of 2021 all the way to the end of 25, where we publish in a very transparent manner to all stakeholders all the activities, all the ambitions and the commitments that we make on all the E, S, and G activities. And once this is published, or this was published for the first time at the beginning of the year, and we measure every quarter. So when we go to the presentation of the results of the company, so of course we have the financial section, but in the extra financial section, we actually essentially present our dashboard along the lines of our sustainability plan progress. And we do this every quarter, and we will continue to do that every quarter until the end of the program. One point to note is, of course, important as a message to the outside world, to the investors. Obviously, we want to see, we want companies like Schneider Electric to walk the talk, to demonstrate that we do what we said we would do, of course, obviously. It's also a powerful vector of engagement internally for our employees, because people want to see the change for the most part. So it's a great way, if you want, of putting visible on a relatively short span of time what we are doing. And lastly, we are a company of 140,000 people. Roughly 50% of the company has remuneration, which is indexed on the performance of this dashboard. So everybody has a vested interest in making sure that this is going to move in the right direction. So in short, global, all scopes, measurement in a very short time period every quarter for us, but of course, making sure that we have a trajectory that is in line with what science is telling us on the 1.5 degree.
Great. Fantastic. So that's excellent. Thank you. So we've gone from sort of targets through to implementation. I just wanted to, we have about 9 minutes left. I just wanted to touch a little bit on the technology rollout and sort of combining the sort of technology that exists today with the sort of hard to abate. So maybe just touching on a few things that we haven't really talked about. And I'm going to ask Julian a little bit about collaboration across value chains, particularly in the sort of hard to abate sectors. because clearly that's going to be very important for oil and gas companies. And so just how is that approached? How do you think about that?
Yeah, no, thanks, John. And I just want to, just echo the previous panel that I'm very, very quite aligned with what was said. But when it comes to the technology, so OGCI is about collaboration. Like by definition, we are a group of companies, and some of our members are a little bit ahead of the curve on different topics, and so they share the knowledge. That's one aspect where we collaborate, and we have a joint fund, our climate investment fund, where we scout the next generation of technology to tackle some of the low carbon transition segments. But also by being a coalition, some aspects of the low carbon transition are becoming, too competitive, let's say, for our member companies to collaborate on. That's the case, for instance, of the renewable energy space. This is a competitive market for our member, and they are all investing quite a lot of money and effort into this market. And so the same thing happened for all other type of the segment of the low carbon economy. So we have to focus our effort on where we can be additional, and that is notably, for instance, on hydrogen, the hard to abate transport segment like marine and shipping, as I was mentioning before, CCUS, but also one aspect that has been relatively neglected, I think, for too long, which is the methane emission. And the methane challenge, as you know, is one of the greenhouse gas emission, the second largest, and it's contributing quite significantly actually to the climate challenge. And also it has a short lifetime, and so if you tackle the flow of methane going into the atmosphere, you can reduce the stock which is contained, and this is what is generating the warming effect that we're experiencing today. So tackling the methane is of utmost importance, and that's where as well the collaboration is key, because there is a number of technologies. The difficulty with methane is that, generally speaking, it's associated with leakage, and so something that is unintended. And so we are investing and we are scouting some program to help to gain in transparency on the methane emission across the oil and gas value chain. So for instance, we are deploying satellite emission data acquisition across countries that have also potential difficulties to address the challenge, like Iraq, Algeria, Turkmenistan, Kazakhstan. So not looking only at the developed part of the world, but also the developing part of the world, and where we can help here and to provide this kind of transparency. We've joined forces as well with Environmental Defense Fund or United Nations or the IEA, again, with the perspective of collaborating with others as well and with the rest of the institutions, as well as, the same thing happened on flaring, etc. We have a number of, I think when it comes to the value chain aspect, and particularly for the oil and gas sector, that is very important. I mean, we know that the footprints of the scope 1, 2, and 3 of the oil and gas sector, as I mentioned before, it's 20 gigaton. It's huge. It's really huge. So if we want to address the scope 3 of the oil and gas sector, we have to bring some solution to our customers that can enable them to limit their consumption or reduce their consumption of oil and gas products. And so this is why we are also investing in all these new solutions, because as you know, the energy market is a market where the demand and the offer have to meet almost in real time. So you cannot only play on the offer and expecting the demand to switch overnight. You have to play as well on the demand and be able to provide new type of solution. I think what Xavier was mentioning about the market of Schneider is extremely inspiring from that perspective, because you have addressed this challenge, I think, in a very meaningful manner. So yeah, that's just a few examples. Maybe if I could add one, which is an aspect of for the hard to abate.
Briefly, yes.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, I was about just to mention very briefly the cement and the steel industry, which are both sectors also that are emitting greenhouse gas emissions that are very difficult to abate. And here again, I mean, what we look at is to try to build some joint projects with them, notably on the carbon capture and storage, which is a solution that could help to decarbonize this sector. So.
Great. Yep. Thank you. Yeah. So collaboration into all of these new and difficult areas seems, and in countries, the developing countries seems to be important. So two more quick questions. One just for Laurence in terms of. It feels like over time, sort of, 10 years ago, it was really unclear, even if renewables would be a piece of the jigsaw. It seems to be over time, more of the components of the technology have become clear. How have you seen that develop? Over the last few years? Are you optimistic that sort of more corners are being worked on at the same time, or do you think we're still moving too slowly?
Well, the problem is all the evolution are pointing in the right direction, and even listening to Julian, who is of course at the core, in a way, of the problem, we see this positive evolution, including in the investment on the oil and gas industry. But the problem is we just started far too late. So the problem is how we combine, which is a normal evolution, or even accelerate evolution of the transition technology, which anywhere renewable energy, of course, offer a lot. And there's this perspective of green hydrogen. Again, 2 or 3 years ago, we were absolutely sure this was very far away in time. Now it's coming much more on a commercial basis, maybe closer. But then the problem is we are running against time. And again, listening to Julian, there are elements that we have to earn time. Methane is a big thing. Stopping flaring is a big thing. So we need to be much more radical, really, frankly, if we want to let alone even an accelerated rhythm of deployment of new technology, even the ones who were not thinking mature enough and has been really accelerating in their productivity, etc. But then we need to earn time. And so that's why, in a way, the oil and gas companies are playing a central role if we want to earn time. And I hope everybody will listen to that message.
Okay, great. Yeah, thank you for that. So all eyes on oil and gas. And what I would just my last question is for Antonina. Really, with your sort of representing youth hat on, if there was 1 or 2 key messages for the leaders of private companies, what would that be? What do you think the younger generations would really want to see from private company leaders?
It's difficult to represent a full generation, of course, but I think from the conversations I've had with other people working in the space that are also early career people working in climate, I think we definitely want to see more ambition and more action. And I think one thing that would be really powerful to underpin the long-term targets and even the interim targets would be pledges and disclosure on CapEx expenditure, so capital expenditures and current projects. What are you doing now? I think that would be a strong signal to, just underpin, because targets are great. It's amazing that we're seeing so much net zero, but it needs to come with action. And I think that's kind of the space where we can start to measure actual action and not just pledges. And I think the second key message that I would bring up again is about climate justice. And I think companies oh, sorry. I just heard a bit of feedback. Would be around climate justice and really understanding that companies that have the capacity to decarbonize before 2050 really should. This is really needed to allow space for emerging market economies who have development priorities to tackle, so that they have a bit more space in the carbon budget to meet those development priorities, because they contribute at least to the problem, and they shouldn't be withheld from meeting a comfortable quality of life. So I would say CapEx and sooner net zero targets, sooner than 2050 for most companies that we're talking about. The largest companies should be aiming earlier than 2050.
Great.
Thanks.
Thank you very much. That's a great point to finish on in terms of, ambition is good, but in terms of action, some very specific things around CapEx and then a sort of element of justice in terms of the target setting and people moving as fast as they can. So I just want to say thank you very much for all the panelists. We could talk a lot longer about this topic, but thank you for sharing your views, and have a good day, everybody. Thank you very much.